button on here so we can record this for posterity. And welcome everybody to the Sunday school class here in June. We're going to talk about the EPA today. Kind of switch topics from all the protests going on and talk about we should be out protesting for the environment. Maybe that'll be next month's topic perhaps. But we're going to learn today about what the EPA does, and then next week Ron is going to talk about the war on the EPA and how so many regulations are being dismantled and the effect that's having. So that should be good. But welcome to everybody. Any announcements before we get started? Voting is going on. I got my ballot in the mail and filled it out. Everybody get your ballot?
Yes.
Good. Good. Lots going on. Interesting race between Romanoff and Hickenlooper, and the debate last week, and Hickenlooper running into some problems with the Ethics Commission, and it's been quite an interesting race. So we'll see what happens with that. All righty. If there's no other announcements, we will just go to our presenter, Ron Puning, retired engineer and our frequent presenter of good topics, and we will learn about the environment today. So thanks for being with us, and Ron, take it away.
Okay, can you see my slide?
Not yet.
No, not yet. Did you hit your share screen?
Oh boy, I may have to
Go down to share screen on the bottom.
back to Zoom.
If not, we'll be
Share
talking
screen.
about
Yeah, here we go. Here we go.
There we are.
There we go.
Okay, there
You
we go.
got it.
Alrighty.
Okay, Ron.
We're going to try opening today with a song. We're going to say the name of the lady. So if you have a ALEXA system, my voice might activate it. Because I'm going to call up a song by Joni Mitchell here. Alexa, play Big Yellow Taxi by Joni Mitchell.
Here's Big Yellow Taxi by Joni Mitchell on Amazon Music.
Can you hear it?
Oh, yeah.
Yep.
With a big hotel, a boutique, and a swinging hot spot. Don't it always seem to go that you don't know what you've got till it's gone? You pay paradise, put up a parking lot. Took all the trees, put them in a tree museum. And they charge the people $1.50 just to see them. Don't it always seem to go that you don't know what you've got till it's gone? You need to realize put up a parking lot. We find a farmer with a DD. He's bought some apples, but leave it a birds and the bees. Please don't it always seem to go that you don't know what you've got till it's gone. You pay paradise, put up a parking lot. Late last night, the screen door slammed, and a big yellow taxi took away my old name. Don't it always seem to go that you don't know what you've got till it's gone? You pay paradise, put up a parking lot. I said, don't it always seem to go that you don't know what you've got till it's gone? You pay paradise, put up a parking lot. You pay paradise, put up a parking lot. You pay paradise, put up a parking lot.
Ron, my Alexa downstairs heard you too, so I had it go in both places.
Oh, okay.
know that happened around the house a lot.
Okay.
Ron, I've never
Did you come
seen.
across on the Zoom here?
Yeah,
Did everybody hear it? Okay.
it's
How
great.
many remember that song?
Oh, I do.
Okay.
Ron, I've never seen a tree museum, but maybe there is such a thing.
Yeah, you get into it for $1.50.
Okay. On our opening slide here, we've got the famous September 1969 fire on the Cuyahoga River up near Cleveland, Ohio, where it empties into Lake Erie. And it wasn't just a little small area. It was a massive fire, put out tremendous plumes of smoke. It was a real doozy. So let's see if we can.
Ron, what was in the river that caused the fire?
Okay.
Oil?
It was, petroleum product.
Wanna come here?
And in fact, there's a picture of the river
Over here?
prior to it catching on fire. See that orangish
Oh, gee.
crud? Yeah.
I had a friend that used to row on the Cuyahoga River, but they took that particular day off.
Okay. A lot of the material today came from this very recent issue book. It just came out a few months ago, The War on the EPA. Nice summary, a lot of up-to-date. Having grown up in Cincinnati, Ohio, this shows air pollution. Cincinnati is, of course, in the far southwest corner of Ohio. And I looked at the top 10 air polluters in the nation. And like 9 out of 10 are just to the southwest of my hometown of Cincinnati. How's that?
Explains a lot.
Talk about places not to live. So, yeah, so some of the biggest and oldest coal burning emission power plants are all in that corridor along the Ohio River, downstream of Cincinnati, and it flows fresh towards Cincinnati. Up in Montana, for those who have driven the interstate, going over towards maybe heading up to Glacier or something, you'll go through Butte, and you don't see it from the interstate, but there's the largest Superfund site in the United States, just north and along the rivers coming out of Butte, Montana.
Oh, my God.
One site that's got 25 billion gallons contaminated groundwater. That's a lot.
Oh, my gosh.
Yeah, and they had one case where a huge flock of snow geese landed on the contaminated water pit, started frolicking in it, and by the next morning there were hundreds of dead snow geese all over the pond. Here's a picture of a mine drainage creek coming out of Soda Butte Creek there in Montana. And how many have been to Ouray and seen the orange stream running down into it?
Yeah, I have.
Yes. The famous $1 million highway between Silverton and Ouray, Colorado. And if you look at the creek, actually it's a small river, you'll see it looks orangish, just like you see in this picture from mine drainage. Here's another picture of the Berkeley Pit north of Butte, Montana, which is, again, one of the worst Superfund sites is the worst in the country. And you've probably heard of the Summitville mine, which is a Superfund site, so badly polluted that the lower right corner of the slide here shows a water treatment plant that they think will have to run to perpetuity, run by the state of Colorado and paid by its citizens to clean up drainage coming off of this giant holding pond area there at Summit. This is a quick map showing Colorado streams that are affected by heavy metals. You might like heavy metal or rock music, but heavy metals are not good for water, and they tend to kill just about everything in the water, fish, whatever, if allowed. You can see there's more Colorado streams affected than we'd like. Now, all of these shown in this drawing aren't total killers of all life, but at least there's some significant or bad pollution in all these. And you can see that if we continued at this pace, contaminating rivers and streams in Colorado, and just let it go unabated for several more generations, it wouldn't be long where we didn't have much river water left that wasn't contaminated. This next slide I've titled Porky Pig Problems. This picture you see is a giant hog farm in North Carolina, and there's these giant hog waste lagoons of filth. And particularly during heavy rains and floods, these hog waste ponds tend to get into the rivers and creeks of North Carolina. There's a map of North Carolina shown on the bottom of the slide, and it shows the counties of North Carolina, and the ones that are in the dark brown color, those are counties with over 1 million hogs just in that county alone.
Okay.
So more hogs than there are people in North Carolina, and they've had some tremendous struggles with hog farm waste getting into the watersheds of North Carolina.
They're
Could we have
also,
people mute their so we don't hear any background noise, mute their speaker?
Thank you.
Ron, I was going to tell you there are more Presbyterians in North Carolina than there are people too.
Oh, yeah.
All righty.
Hmm.
One of the things we learn about in ecology and environment is that sources are sometimes called broad area sources or point sources. A point source for pollution is like a giant industrial smokestack, where a broad area is like a bunch of agricultural fields. And one of the biggest problems we're having right now, particularly in the Gulf of Mexico, and where there are literally tens of thousands of septic tanks or farm fields that have phosphate fertilizers put on them that are dumping runoff. And this runoff is largely unregulated. It's certainly affected Chesapeake Bay. This diagram here showing the pounds of nitrogen pollution and phosphorus pollution getting into the Chesapeake Bay. And we can see from the bronze orange color there that the primary contributor to nitrogen and phosphorus pollution in Chesapeake Bay is farms. The number 2 one is the wastewater treatment plants, and, septic tanks, stormwater runoff. So it's not easy to control pollution, and we look at the different sources. Right now in Florida, I read yesterday where 2 Republican legislators are putting in much more strict laws on septic tanks, where if you have a septic tank down there, you need to get it inspected every year and take corrective measures if there's something deficient about your septic tank. They also have now some pretty strict laws on when you can put fertilizers on. You're not allowed to put fertilizers on your lawn of certain types in certain months of the year, and they're fighting hard to try to combat the horrific problem they've had with algae, particularly the more toxic algae that kill fish and turn the water red, green, and other strange colors. This is what they call a hypoxic zone. As the Mississippi River pours water from the central United States in its massive drainage basin into the Gulf of Mexico, there's an oxygen deficient dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico that is massive in size. And this kills aquatic life, knocks out things like hunting for shrimp, and kills a lot of the fish. And this zone is tending to grow. And it's not from toxic chemicals traditional like cadmium or zinc, but it's from oxygen grabbing nutrients like phosphorus from fertilizers and things like that. So it's a big part of the pollution issue. How many here have heard of combined sewer overflows? Anyone? Okay. Most people don't realize it, but a lot of sewer systems in the United States, particularly with a lot of the older cities back east, they have what they call a combined sewer system, where your toilet and your street runoff go into the same system and then go to the wastewater treatment plant. Well, that works okay when there's not heavy rainstorms, but there's many times where there's severe rainstorms in some of these cities, and it puts so much stormwater off the streets into the sewer system that the wastewater treatment plant can't handle it, and they're forced to dump raw sewage mixed with the rainwater into the rivers. And this situation exists in over 700 cities, most of them in the eastern United States. And what you see here is a picture of a combined sewer overflow in Louisville, Kentucky, where they've built a massive concrete underground structure that can hold multi-millions of gallons of overflow water, so that they catch all the water during a heavy rain. It's mixed with the sewerage, and they're able to capture it and then send it on a slower basis to the wastewater treatment plant and not pour it into the Ohio River as untreated raw sewage. So this is another pollution challenge we face. Okay, let's get started with the EPA. Most people don't realize the EPA was actually signed off on by Richard Nixon in 1970. In 1970, there was a very progressive Congress that was seriously wanting to address things like the Cuyahoga River fire. And so in a short period of time, the basic legal basis for the EPA got started, as well as the EPA itself. 1970, the Clean Air Act. 72, the Clean Water Act. Acts covered insecticides, rodenticides, Safe Water Drinking Act in 74, Superfund in 1980, and all these acts other than Superfund were signed by Presidents Nixon and Ford. So politically speaking, there was more moderation. There wasn't the starkness of the divide between liberals, conservatives, Democrats, Republicans, and there were quite a few environmental rules that were put through successfully in the 70s.
Ron, it's nice to know that Nixon did something good. We can remember at least one good thing that he did. So thanks for bringing that to us.
And he did open relations with China.
China also.
Yeah. Okay. The first big EPA enforcement, EPA now was officially formed in 1970 and had a little bit of teeth to it finally. Armco, I think that's Armco Steel, was dumping almost 1,000 pounds of cyanide every day into the Houston Ship Channel. There's a picture of it. And 380 pounds of phenols, 6,000 to 12,000 pounds of ammonia every day. And they did take Armco to court. Armco did say they were going to settle it, but they did give them some time. They didn't give them an immediate cease and desist order before they shut them down from dumping all these bad things in the Houston Ship Channel. Okay, the EPA itself. I put a picture of some feudal society. One guy jokingly talked about NASA when he visited some of the NASA centers. He said, you know, NASA's like a lot of feudal kingdoms that are fighting each other. So NASA is kind of split up and not strongly centrally controlled. And the same thing is so for EPA. There's 10 regional offices for EPA. There's a little map on the bottom of here showing that we are in Region 8, and the central headquarters for Region 8 is in Denver, Colorado. I think it's pretty close. I think it's on Wine Coop downtown. It's very close to the stadium. And in general, EPA has delegated a lot of its authority to the states, more so in states like Colorado, where we have strong local capabilities, less so in small states like Wyoming or North Dakota that don't have much state capability. The EPA administrator and the top officials are political appointees. So they're not career people, the top people in the EPA. The long-term career staff is dedicated to environmental protection. I know I took several classes in environmental science, and at least a couple of them were taught by EPA staff people. There are separate program offices, not only to cover different kinds of pollution, which means if you go downtown to the Denver EPA office, there's separate offices to deal with air pollution, surface water, drinking water, etc. The EPA also has science advisory boards that are supposed to independently review the science behind the key decisions, and a Clean Air Scientific Advisory Committee. And of course, just about every, if not every EPA law is put out there for public comment well before it's even considered to be put into law. And they usually take public comments and have public hearings for many months prior to formulating a new EPA rule. Another act that went into effect in 1976, sometimes called RCRA, Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, or Solid Waste Disposal Act. Here's a movie most of you have probably not seen. John Travolta starred in a movie called A Civil Action. And it's worth watching this movie. It's a good movie, and it's based on fact. It's not fiction. And it dealt with the dangerous disposal of dangerous barrels of solid waste. An action that was taken by a bold lawyer to call attention to it. 1976 was the Toxic Substances Control Act. How many have seen the movie Erin Brockovich?
Yep.
Also another good movie worth seeing. At the time the Toxic Substances Control Act was formed, there was a list of about 62,000 chemicals. And the intent was to try to start to wean through these lists of chemicals and pull out the ones that were really bad and dangerous and get them banned. But right now we've only got 5 chemicals that have been banned. PCBs, asbestos, dioxin, chromium-6, and chromium-6 was the chemical brought up in the Erin Brockovich movie, and fully halogenated chlorofluoroalkanes, and those are the upper ozone destroyers. So there's not that many chemicals that are outright banned right now, really just a handful. They're trying to add to that list, but it's a difficult process. Next week, we'll get into a few chemicals that have come up just in the last 12 months to be banned and have not been banned. But that's for next week. One of the bad chemicals is, or what they call PCBs. It was a Swedish chemical, or a Swedish chemist in 1964 that was doing studies on DDT. And he took blood samples of himself, his wife, his at least 3 children, and he found DDT in all of them. And it wasn't just his family. He took blood samples of different animals in nature and found that DDT was showing up in just about everybody. He went into an eagle collection, eagle feather collection, and looked at where when, because they had eagle feathers that had been collected year by year back to 1888. And he found out this mystery chemical started showing up in 1942. And 1968, there were over 1,300 people in Japan who were poisoned by rice bran that was contaminated by PCBs. And the PCBs are found everywhere, with more at the top of the food chain. They found that the peregrine falcon in California had dropped down to like 5 mating pairs. Its ability to reproduce, they found, was almost being entirely stopped by PCBs. So PCBs are nasty. Turns out PCBs were used in electrical transformers and capacitors. They were used as plasticizers in paints and cements, pesticides, caulkings, wood floor sealants, some dishwater detergents, and even implants. And production peaked at 85 million pounds in 1970. If you take the number of Americans, it's now what, about 320 million? 85 million pounds, that's enough to give everybody a quarter pound of the PCBs. That was a lot. And it got into the Hudson River. And Monsanto Chemical kind of hid the reports on PCB dangers. And PCBs contaminated about a 200-mile stretch of the Hudson River. And there were over 1.3 million pounds of PCBs put into the Hudson over a period of 30 years. So there's a chart here you may not be able to read well, but the upper Hudson has over 40 miles of PCB hotspots along the bottom. And still, they haven't got it. I don't know if they'll ever be able to get it completely clean. Another chemical that's come up just in the last 2 years. I don't know, has anybody heard of the water system being shut down there south of Colorado Springs in Fountain, Colorado? This has happened just in the last 3 or 4 years. A chemical called PFAs, big fancy name for per and polyfluoroalkyl substances. And it's turned out that a lot of the military Air Force airfields have been using firefighting foam on crashes. When a plane skids in, can't get the landing gear down, or a plane catches fire at the edge of the runway, they poured tons of this firefighting foam on the airplane in the airfield area. It's gotten into the drinking water. And that's the source of the PFAs down there in Fountain, Colorado. And it's the Air Force Base. What is it, Peterson Air Force Base and Schreiber Air Force Base? I think Peterson's the one with the airfields. So this is a chemical that's coming up in Colorado even now.
What are they doing?
And they're trying to get other water sources. All right, another serious issue is surface impoundment of hazardous waste, particularly from coal-fired power plants. In Kingston, Tennessee, not too far west of Knoxville, Tennessee, Christmas of 2008, they had an earthen wall break, and it put more than 1 billion gallons of water and coal ash into the river valley, contaminating the Emery and Clinch rivers. And it worked its way downstream, and the Ohio River was black for a week, hundreds of miles from the source of this. When they tested the water samples in the Clinch and the Emery, they found that arsenic was 150 times the allowable standard, as well as elevated levels of other toxic metals like lead, thallium, barium, cadmium, chromium, mercury, and nickel. So coal-fired power plant impoundment ponds have turned out to be a really bad thing. They at least do their job when they contain, but if they get a breach or break, bad news for water. Upstream of Cincinnati, they just decommissioned a power plant I had a chance to visit as a college student. They've got 4 ponds in this picture we see, with an estimated 10 billion pounds of coal ash in these ponds. We can see the Ohio River on the far right side of the picture, where you see the Sky 9 caption. And they've got to be careful that they handle this coal ash pile carefully, because if massive amounts of this coal ash get into the Ohio River, they could threaten the drinking water source for more than 5 million people. There was an old joke in Cincinnati, sorry for those who live in Kentucky, flush, the people in Louisville need the water. Of course, there was a sign in the bathrooms in Pittsburgh saying, flush, the people in Cincinnati need the water too. So the Ohio River is a big drinking water source for a lot of folks. And here's a pollution source that most of us ignore, but it's maybe the top one that's threatening all of us. 1988, the EPA estimated there were over 2 million underground storage tanks in the United States. Basically, every gas station in the country has several underground storage tanks with gasoline in it. And they found out that there's over 700,000 underground storage tanks, or USTs, and that 75% of them were put in with steel without any form of corrosion protection. Now, steel isn't bad for corrosion resistance. Some of the steels are pretty good, but just the sheer number of underground storage tanks we've got makes this a hazard. And there's been many locations now where old gas station storage tanks have leaked and are causing problems. So these are, quote, pollution threats that are, quote, all over the place. And every community needs to keep an eye on its gas stations. Another act that was put in 1990, the Oil Pollution Act. You probably remember the famous Exxon Valdez disaster. And this rule was put into place after that. They're now requiring the big tanker ships to have double hulls, or as we called it in the rocket fuel industry, double-shelled pipes. And they're required to have spill response plan and pre-positioned response resources, absorbent material and buoys that can be put out quickly where there's an oil spill. Just in the last 3 weeks, has anyone heard of the big Russian Arctic River oil spill?
Yeah.
Okay, Putin is struggling with this right now. They had an oil storage area. I think it was one of the supports for a massive oil storage tank. It was on thawing Arctic permafrost. Well, it's not permafrost anymore. Support gave way, and it poured millions, apparently, of gallons of oil into the Arctic rivers in the Soviet Union. There's also a picture here of a cleanup on the Yellowstone River up in Montana. Just a couple years ago, they had another oil spill on the Yellowstone River in Montana, over there on the eastern side of Montana. Okay, here's another case. You can tell I'm a native Cincinnatian. About 20 miles downriver of Cincinnati, there's another river that joins the Ohio called the Big Miami. Cincinnati is known as the land between the Miamis. The Big Miami and Little Miami rivers come down through Ohio, and Cincinnati's kind of between those two rivers. But Gulf Oil had a refinery in Hoven, Ohio. It produced a lot of products like jet fuel, diesel fuel. And this refinery was closed in 1986, but they found that there were massive amounts of petroleum products that had gotten down into the soil. And unfortunately, this site is pretty close to the Great Miami River, troublingly close. And there's a plume of oil products. They call it LNAPL, if you see on this slide. It stands for light non-aqueous phase liquid. And this petroleum product floats on the groundwater, but it lies at a depth anywhere from 50 to 70 feet below the ground surface. So that's a long way down. It's hard to get to. And it's floating up and down as a giant plume underground near the river. And they're trying to deal with it. It's a real problem. So again, this shows what happens with some of the petroleum products that get into the soil. They go down until they hit the groundwater level, and they don't permeate into the groundwater, but they float up and down as the water table moves up and down. So there's another problem area for pollution. Okay, the Clean Air Act years, 67. The Clean Air Act has been enforced and strengthened many times. Right now in Colorado, we're in a non-attainment area, and we're basically failing on ozone and particulate matter. And by August of this year, they're supposed to come out with another plan, a more stringent plan to try to get the Front Range into compliance for ozone and particulate matter. And they're going to have more permits required that will set tighter limits for all facilities that emit more than 50 tons per year of VOCs for volatile organic compounds. And this is, of course, one of the key sources of ozone and particulate matter. And as I mentioned last week, you can go to airnow.gov, put in your zip code, and get the pollution reading for the day. There's a nice reading station right there at Roxborough State Park that will give you pretty good data. As I looked at it this morning, and we're in a good air quality zone. It might slip slightly into the orange zone this afternoon on ozone. In this presentation, I haven't touched much on the greenhouse gas emitters, and the greenhouse gas are not as well addressed in the EPA regulations right now. But this drawing does show you the top 10 greenhouse emitters in the state of Colorado, and they're all power plants, the top 10. So certainly, if we're going to address CO2 emissions, we have to pay serious attention to coal-fired power plants. Okay, this slide I call Sneaking Under the Clean Air Act. Clean Air Act required power plants to adopt emission standards if they made any modifications that resulted in a significant increase in regulated pollutants. But the legal beagles, sorry about that, Chris, took a close look at the rule and said, hey guys, if you're modifying your power plant, don't call it an addition or whatever. Call it a upgraded maintenance program or a plant restoration product.
That's exactly right. And there haven't been any new ones built since that act. Because you'd have to comply with scrubbers for all that. But if it's merely a slight modification for efficiency, then it's okay.
But the hope was when they passed this rule that a power plant would have like a 30-year lifetime, and they were hoping that the power plants would fade away, but the owners kept doing modest little sneak under the rules modifications, and some of these power plants have lasted 60 years, so they've not been phased out like they were hoping they would get phased out.
You can't build a new power plant where you can amortize the cost over the life of it because the cost of the scrubbers for the smokestacks.
Okay.
So that's why they do that.
Okay. All right. Couple good cartoons here. Clean coal. You can see the guy saying there, another batch of clean coal. He's hosing it off. And then the how coal creates jobs, the Appalachian Black Lung Clinic. How many read the John Grisham book, Gray Mountain? Has anybody read or heard that on audio?
Good book.
Okay, I think it's one of John Grisham's best. That's my opinion. So I recommend that one, but it does get into the coal industry quite a bit. Okay, again, we mentioned the air quality index. Again, you can look it up. We mentioned that last week. The 6 categories of pollutants that go into the AQI, the ozone, the particulate matter of different size, carbon monoxide, nitrogen dioxide. We won't beat on that. The Clean Water Act, it really traced its origin to the Federal Water Pollution Control Act of '72 that set nationwide limits for discharges. And then the Safe Water Drinking Act. It started by establishing what they call MCLs, or maximum contaminant levels, for 20 contaminants starting in 1998, with the goal of getting from 20 contaminants up to 83. And when they originally put the act in, they said, we're going to start with a list of 25 and try to add contaminants every 3 years. But they decided that was unrealistic. Basically, the problem we're finding is that small waterworks don't have the budget to upgrade or change or renew their systems to get all of these new, exotic, and less known contaminants out of the water. We wish they could, but the financial limits are such that new pharmaceuticals and exotic chemicals are showing up that literally the treatment plant designers can't keep up with how fast new chemicals and pollutants are coming in. And it's very hard to get them all out of drinking water. The Safe Drinking Water Act only applies to public water systems that have at least 15 connections or 25 people served. That means you could have a little subdivision water treatment plant with, say, 12 connections and not have the law apply to you. There's the primary standards that deal with contaminants that are known health hazards, and then there's the secondary drinking water regs that cover things like odor, color, and taste.
Ron?
Yeah.
It is 11:16 if you want to leave some time for discussion.
Yeah, let's wrap up with this slide and move on to next week. And you've all heard of the Flint, Michigan situation. Flint switched from Lake Huron water to Flint River water. And the Flint River water was not treated with an anti-corrosive chemical to prevent lead dissolving. And of course, they ended up pouring heavy amounts of lead into their water pipe distribution system. General Motors noticed it right away and had to get rid of it because when they were washing down their parts, they noticed they had rust spots. So Flint, Michigan is one of the most recent examples of a very severe drinking water problem. You can also go online and get a Denver water report and see how we've come out here in Denver. And the answer is Denver's got some of the best drinking water in the world, put it bluntly. I won't bore you with the copious details, but that's certainly good news that our water level is really good. Probably the key factor behind it is our Denver water collection area is in areas that are not riddled with mines, cattle farms, big agricultural runoffs, people in general, you know, chemical plants.
Ron, what's the website to check the quality of Denver water?
If you want to look at the Denver water, look up Denver water quality reports. And it's got them from 2019 all the way back to at least the last 20 years. You can look up in copious detail what's in our water, how often they're inspecting it, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, let's stop here. We'll pick up next week with some of the contentious issues. But let's open the morning up for some questions.
Okay. Ron, in your reading, do you think that the EPA has done a good job of protecting the environment?
They get at least a B. They've certainly been hobbled by difficulty of getting political consensus and the long times it takes to get new rules into effect. But the EPA, over its history, has done well. But I'll also put the caveat saying in the last 2 years, the current administration has come after the EPA like a meat cleaver. And they're trying to knock out as many rules as they can, as fast as they can. We'll be discussing that next week. But in general, yeah, the EPA has tried hard, but they're really running into a meat cleaver buzzsaw right now.
I don't know whether everybody else noticed this, but in everything that Ron mentioned, the adversary is a large corporation, and usually a large corporation that is quite profitable. And to me, that translates, that says that we are willing and that we are fighting the ability of a corporation to make money for its investors, for its stockholders. Corporations were created so that in large groups of people could band together to create projects that would otherwise be almost impossible to make happen because of the necessity to raise money. But the other thing that they do is that they limit the liability of the people that are benefiting from the profitability of the corporation. Now, I remember that there was a time a while back that there was quite a bit of talk about having stockholders and investors in corporations that were profiting from pollution and other types of environmental degradation. that they would make their liability absolute so that they would be highly motivated, their investors would be highly motivated to correct their practices. But I don't think that has gone too far. But it seems to me like an awful lot of the times that we get into discussions about things like this, that we start talking about the weather, but we're not doing anything about it. And if we would start doing something about it, maybe our grandchildren and our children and our would not have to bear the responsibility for cleaning up the mess that we are making now. And one way is to make the liability for pollution absolute and make it pass through to the investors. And then the investors would say to these companies, stop polluting, start taking care of the environment. The end.
Okay. Good point.
That's a good point. Ron, did you read anything about if the EPA was often successful in suing Monsanto or putting restrictions on big companies?
We'll discuss that more next week. During different administrations, the enforcement of EPA rules has drifted from sometimes very lax to strong. There was a time when several new presidents have come in and literally turned their back on enforcement, okay?
But they did create all the Superfund sites, which we wouldn't have but for the EPA.
True.
Ron, has it generally been Republicans are less interested in the environment and Democrats more interested?
Yeah. Stay
Administration.
tuned for next week, and we're going to start looking at the political climate starting from 1980 going forward to current day, and look how the different administrations have acted towards the environment. And the answer is yes. Generally, the Republican Party has represented big industry and agriculture. And big industry and agriculture generally don't like environmental rules.
And agriculture is the same thing as big industry, because almost all agriculture is now controlled by what, 3 or 4 giant multinational corporations.
Yeah, there's still small farms and medium farms, but more and more, yeah, it's
But the preponderance is controlled by ConAgra and the other.
yeah. So yeah, we'll touch some political hot potatoes next week in particular. So bring your earmuffs and your whatever.
We've got about 5 minutes left. Ron, I'm glad you touched on the water quality and local public water systems can't keep up with really testing every chemical that flows in there. It's kind of frustrating as a citizen to know that our water can't be 100% safe, that they can't test for everything. Any thoughts on how they could do better?
Water, more testing, but then again, you've got to put money into some better water treatment plants. Of course, we've got to look at both folks like us, the majority of whom get their water from a large metropolitan area water district, versus all the many Americans who are relying on private wells. My grandfather had a lot of pigs on his farm in Ohio. So here on one side of a creek that flowed through his farm, he had a big pig farm. And no more than 150 yards on the other side of the creek was his well. And I often wonder, how deep did that well go? And was there a plume of pig waste potentially moving towards that water well? And
think about that.
It would have been nice in fact, for all farmers and people who have small private wells. Yeah, they'd be a lot better off if they could have in-depth and very frequent testing of their water sources.
Ron, do you have any information about the Highlands Ranch water system? Most of the suburbs of Denver, use Denver water, but I think Highlands Ranch has its own water supply.
I'd have to dig more. I know that there are some aquifers. There, of course, is groundwater, and Highlands Ranch does tap some of the aquifers.
Thank you.
So I'll have to look that up for next week. I know there's concern about the aquifers dropping in level. It's everybody that has wells south of Denver is having to drill deeper to get the water. Although I think the quality is pretty decent. I think it's more an issue of quantity and the aquifer being not depleted versus the quality of it. I think the quality of it's quite good. But I'll look into it in more detail.
Do the aquifers recharge here in West Texas, for example? You get down to the aquifer and it's sand, and once you get to a certain level, the sand compacts and it won't recharge.
Okay. Aquifers vary in terms of their rechargeability. Some of the extremely deep ones, unless you put an injection well, take hundreds of years to recharge. Some of the other ones can be recharged in maybe a decade. But so it varies depending on how deep the aquifer is and how broad it is, and other factors.
Ron, I know some people like to take a water test sample from their own house to a independent lab to check that their particular water pipes coming into their house aren't putting a lot of stuff into their water. I mean, they may have confidence their water district is doing a good job, but actually going into your house or your building, there might be a lot of junk coming off of the pipes. Have you heard of any folks around here doing that?
Downtown Denver, where you have some of the older homes, particularly, they may have had some lead pipes in downtown Denver too. I'm not sure of Denver's history. That's certainly less of a factor out here in the more modern suburbs. Places like where
Going back to pick on poor old Houston again, they found in some of the downtown areas when they dug down to the pipes, there was no pipe left and the water was just running through hardened dirt.
And there's also the issue when you put chlorine in your water, and that's an absolute essential thing to do to kill all the E. coli and other things. But the chlorine does react chemically with other things in the water and can create some other contaminants that are mild carcinogens. Translation, even if your house has perfect pipes with chlorinated water coming into it, if you leave that dead end pipeline untouched with no flow in it for a period of many, many months, the water quality degrades substantially. Translation, use your water system. Keep it flushed and keep the drinking water moving. If you don't use it for a period of many, many months, you're going to run the contamination levels higher.
Well, one of the things that impacted water, especially in older areas, is that I think it's 1950 or 1960, but I can't remember exactly when. But up until that time, plumbers were taught a discipline of how to create lead joints in their pipes. Most of the pipes in those days were galvanized, and they created lead joints, which were quite toxic and deteriorated. And also, almost all solders in those days were lead-based solders, so that any kind of joints that, even if they were soldered, even if they were sweated the way that they do now, they don't use lead-based solders now, but they did up until I think it was about 30 years ago.
It's a wonder that we've survived it all when we think about all the stuff that goes on. It's 11:32. Let's wrap up with final questions for Ron.
Ron, I had a question about fountain. Are they still having to use bottled water?
I heard they were using bottled water and water brought in from other sites.
Okay, and when
Until
they,
they can get that chemical out of their water system.
when they use it, what about taking showers and cooking with it? Do they use bottled everything? How do they do showers?
I'm not, it depends on the concentration of the PCBs. Certainly drinking something is an order or two magnitude worse than showering in it. But if you get
Also,
enough,
what's happening with the Los Alamos River problem with, you know, when the mine, it contaminated the Los Alamos, and then downstream, the Ute Reservoir, the water supply being affected. Do you know anything about that? You know,
I'd have to go read the latest, but definitely some nasty stuff got into the Animas River, yes.
Ron, does a water softener do anything positive for drinking water?
I don't think it, well, it changes the quote hardness of the water, meaning the ability of the water to dissolve soaps and shampoos and stuff improves as you soften the water. I'd have to look and see if the softener agent does anything to safety of the water. I don't think it does. I think it's mostly dealing with the water's mineral content and its ability to dissolve soaps and things like that.
What about the filters in refrigerators?
They certainly take out a lot of contaminants. The negative side to a filter is if you leave the filter there for a long period of time, and most of us do, upstream of the filter, you collect a lot of nasty things. So it's a trade-off. You filter the water daily, but you also form a dam where upstream of the dam you're collecting all these nasty things. That's the drawback of a filter that isn't cleaned or backflushed or changed often.
Well, we do for ice.
Great discussion today, guys. Thank you, Ron, for another good presentation.
Thank you, Ron.
Thank you.
Thank
Okay,
you.
if you come back next week, we've got some more exciting, electrifying stuff. So.
All right.
A commercial.
Thanks, everybody, for joining us. We'll see you next week.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
That was really good.
Yeah, that song by Joni Mitchell, by the way, is called Big Yellow Taxi.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Ron.
All right.
Thanks.
Thank you, Ron.
Everybody.
Hey, Ron, I've got another question. I don't know if I can keep on asking.
Yeah, go ahead.
Flint, Michigan, you know, real estate, who would want to move there? Are they compensated at all when areas like that are so affected by the water supply? You know, there's no way they're going to be able to sell their homes and have anybody move in who knows anything about what's going on there.
Yeah, now, of course, it's restricted to the Flint water system, this issue, but you're absolutely right. Once they find there's a major pollution problem in your home or area, yeah, and people find out about it, it can make your property very hard to sell.
One thing, our daughter went to visit Michigan State for going to graduate school there a few years ago. I went there as an undergraduate, and she said, Mom, everybody has filters on their water in the dorms, every building. I was surprised. She didn't know why, but they've filtered all their water on campus. I thought that was interesting. And I haven't been able to find out any more info about why they're doing it.
Yeah, I'll have to look and see if the filter takes out lead. I'm not so sure it does.
Okay. Just
Every filter has limitations in terms of,
yeah, I was just curious about that. I went to school there. And she ended up not going there, which was fine with me. Anyway, thank you again, Ron. That was really good.
okay.
Okay, thanks, Ron. I'm gonna shut it off now.
All right.
Bye.
Thanks again.
Bye-bye. See you, Alice.